And now it's a great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Robert Darnton, who is Carl H. Pforzheimer University Professor and Harvard University Librarian Emeritus. Please welcome Professor Darnton.
I feel rather diffident about my topic because it is utterly un-Warburg-like. We've had a long day. I hope you will tolerate a little bit of deviation from these wonderful themes we've heard. I have no iconography, no close analysis of text, nothing even vaguely hermeneutical, but it has to do with the diffusion of culture seen from an unfamiliar perspective, namely business history. But David Friedberg encouraged me to go ahead with this talk, and so here goes. It begins with a question. How did books reach readers in 18th century France? Now, first I should explain that supply and demand could not operate freely on the French market owing to three factors: censorship, the monopoly of the Parisian Booksellers Guild, and the repression of unauthorized literature by special inspectors of the book trade. France was surrounded by what I call a fertile crescent of publishing houses, dozens and dozens of publishers all the way from Amsterdam and Brussels through the Rhineland into Switzerland. This fertile crescent produced most of the books that actually circulated on the book market during the 18th century. Foreign publishers produced virtually the entire Enlightenment, along with many other kinds of illegal literature and especially pirated books. Now, no one has ever doubted the importance of the foreign presses, but no one has asked two questions that I think are fundamental to understanding the subject. How did publishers publish books? i.e., what calculations and business strategy did they pursue? And secondly, how did booksellers order books? That is to say, what was their role in mediating supply and demand? First, I'd like to discuss the actual practices of publishers. Now, the only publishing house from the 18th century whose complete archives have survived is the Société Typographique de Neuchâtel, STN. But fortunately, these archives are enormous. They're a sort of historian's dream come true. 50,000 letters from every sector of the book trade. And they can be supplemented by state archives, which reveal the administrative aspects of the book trade. I have been studying both sets of archives since 1965, and now I hope at last to condense all that research into a single book. But that's not easy because of the richness of the documentation, and so I have begun by creating a website, which you are welcome to consult. It's open access, robertdarnton.org. That's what it looks like. By way of a preliminary presentation to this complex subject, I want to concentrate on the way publishers did business and the way they understood what they were doing, because, of course, they lived in utterly different worlds from publishers today. Of course, there was no international copyright. The modern concept of copyright didn't exist except in England after 1710, and even then it was quite nebulous. What did exist were various kinds of privileges derived from the Latin word for private law. And these privileges applied very imperfectly only within limited territories. In the eyes of the French, the Swiss, who reprinted books with French privileges, were pirates. But the Swiss saw them as very respectable businessmen, pillars of society. Reprinting, or piracy, if you like, was a big business exercised by publishers all around France. They supplied most of Europe with French books. So there was a race to satisfy demand on the French market from many competing publishers. They hired special agents to inform them about the latest, hottest books. They did genuine market research, and when they were not cutting each other's throats, they even cooperated. I have found formal non-aggression pacts among pirate publishers. To beat their competitors to the market, they sometimes made alliances, printed books together, shared the costs and risks, and split the profits. As a result, many editions of the same books were produced at the same time by many publishers, all of them rushing to get to the market first. To limit risks, they produced small editions, usually about 1,000 copies, and then they reprinted if the demand continued. The key factor was actually paper, not the cost of labor. And that is why our libraries today, including the Warburg, contain so many different editions with important variations. So publishing was fundamentally different from what it is today, when a best-selling book is produced by one publisher who puts out many successive editions or sells it to a paperback publisher for a mass public. This was a world of unbridled competition, booty capitalism, if you want to call it that, outside the law and outside the reach of copyright. And that is what I think makes it so fascinating, because you can actually sense the demand for literature if you get deep enough into the archives. This was a world that created great potential profits and even greater risks. To minimize risks, publishers often traded a large proportion of a new edition, 100 or more copies, for an assortment of an equal number of books in the stock of one or more allied publishers. Exchanges were usually calculated according to the number of sheets involved in the trade. And when a publisher selected an assortment, of course, it chose the books that it thought would sell best. In this way, it minimized risk, for it could not be sure that an edition it printed would get to the market before the competing editions, or that it would sell out adequately enough to cover the investment of its capital. And at the same time, through the exchanges, this publisher maximized the value and variety of his own stock. When a bookseller ordered a work that it did not have in stock, the Société Typographique de Neuchâtel often procured it by an ad hoc trade or a discount purchase with an allied publisher in Lausanne or Bern or Geneva. Publishing, as practiced by the major Swiss and Dutch houses, was therefore inseparable from wholesaling, and cooperation within alliances of publisher wholesalers meant that they could draw on a large corpus of literature that was available to all of their allies. As a result of the swapping system, the larger publishers built up enormous stocks of books procured from one another. They call them livres d'assortiment, as opposed to livres de fonds. The STN, in its account books, which are fascinating to read, kept separate accounts for books that it accumulated by exchanges. They were called comptes d'échange, in contrast to the individual accounts that it kept for each of its own editions. In 1785, its catalog included 700 titles, the vast majority produced by other publishers. In 1787, it had 1,500 different works in its warehouse. In 1773, it bragged, quote, "No book of any merit appears in France that we are not capable of providing," end quote. Now, all this may sound rather strange to you, especially since you've been enjoying the exegesis of symbols, but if you're interested in the way literature actually reached readers, I think it's important because it's never been noticed by historians. So let me stress one fundamental point. Publishers were wholesalers. These two aspects of their business were inseparable. I'm going to skip over a lot of slides because I've had to cut my talk a great deal. Oh, too much. You may not be able to read it, but I'd like you to look at the left side of the screen and just notice the numbers. So I'd like to move on to the second question: how did booksellers order books? First, I should point out one factor that made their ordering strategy fundamentally different of booksellers today. Returns did not exist. Therefore, retail booksellers tended to be cautious in ordering because they could not return unsold copies. In fact, they often arranged sales with their own customers before placing an order with a wholesaler publisher who supplied them. As a rule, retailers ordered small numbers of copies for each book, usually less than 10 copies, sometimes a dozen, if that offered them an opportunity to get a free 13th copy. But they ordered enough different books to make up a fairly large shipment. As one of the booksellers explained in a letter, a widow who had inherited her husband's business, quote, "My husband's principle in ordering was to take many items and small numbers of each," end quote. Now, books were usually shipped in loose sheets. The consumer, or sometimes the retailer, would bind them. These sheets were gathered together in bales, balles, weighing at least 50 pounds, so that they could travel by wagon loads at the cheapest possible rate. If they weighed less than 50 pounds, the wagon drivers would refuse them, and they had to travel by coach. Because shipping costs were so expensive relative to the value of the merchandise, the wagon coach, or voiture carrosse distinction, was crucial to the book trade. Therefore, a retailer, the example I take is a fellow called Charmet of Besançon, the most important bookseller in the city of Besançon, preferred to order large assortments of books from the STN and a few other wholesalers instead of scattering his orders among many different suppliers. And so you can see on the left the numbers of copies that he has included in one single order. Because he sent in his orders regularly over many years, 20 years in fact, they provide an accurate picture of his trade. And then there was one other additional factor in the trade, and I think in early modern capitalism in general, confiance, or confidence. Although it connoted credit, confiance also indicated trust, a mutual sense of reliability built up in the course of continuous commercial relations. Confidence was crucial in a trade that took place over long distances, and that also depended on the reliability of signatures on bills of exchange. You may know the French phrase, ne fiez qu'à la signature. I think it was really a central ingredient in the history of capitalism. So, as a result of these factors, wholesaler-retailer relations in the international book trade developed organically over time and unevenly over space. Each publisher-wholesaler gradually built up its own network of clients, strong in some places, absent in others. And each retailer favored a few suppliers who often offered special terms, longer credit, quicker shipments, and discounts, as in the case of the baker's dozen provision. So excuse me as I move backward through much too much material. These are all images and documents from the website, and I don't have quite time to weave them into a single lecture. But one thing I have been doing is to follow a sales rep, a commis voyageur, or traveling sales representative, who got on a horse in July 1787 and spent 5 months investigating, visiting every bookshop he could find in an enormous Tour de France, which you can follow from this map. Now, what I'm trying to indicate is that business, of course, was concentrated in this relation between the publisher-wholesaler and retailers with whom that wholesaler had confidence, who enjoyed these special terms. But, of course, businesses could not be limited to a few confidential exchanges. Like all wholesalers, the Société Typographique de Neuchâtel always strained to expand its sales. It sent prospectuses and catalogs to booksellers in every town in France and nearly every city in Europe. The booksellers often responded by placing 1 or 2 orders par essai, as they put it, to try out a few books on the local market and to test the shipping services, which often got bogged down in delays and expenses. These trial shipments and occasional orders rarely led to sustained relations, mostly because the retailers preferred trusted suppliers who provided better terms and were located closer to their shops. In studying the book trade, it's crucial to consider commercial networks and the distinction between regular and casual relations between wholesalers and retailers. Now, you may not be especially interested in business history. I've been caught by the bug for business history. I find it much more fascinating than expected. But the details may seem esoteric. Still, they have important implications for answering a famous question asked by Daniel Mornay in 1910. What did the French read on the eve of the French Revolution? Well, Mornay thought he found an answer to that question because he discovered a collection of 500 printed catalogs from book auctions. He went through the 500 catalogs, compiled statistics, and you may have know about the famous article, how many copies of Rousseau's Social Contract did he find? Answer, 1. 1 copy of the book that was supposed to become the Bible of the French Revolution. So, said Mornay, tear up all the textbooks, we have to rethink the intellectual origins of the French Revolution from the very beginning. Now, we know today that Daniel Mornay, back in 1910, made many mistakes. For starters, he did not know that printed auction catalogs had to pass the censorship. So by mistake, one censor let through one copy of the social contract. But the point is that by definition, the kind of sources used by Mornay excluded the very sort of thing he was looking for. So quantification can look like a dubious enterprise to many historians, and especially, of course, those who have followed the so-called linguistic or cultural turn. But I am bent on quantifying, among other things, nonetheless, and I mention Mornay to illustrate the methodological pitfalls in this kind of research. So now I'm going to try to avoid the pitfalls and come up with some conclusions. I had to make a key decision in developing a research strategy. This goes back now to 1965. I could have gone straight to the STN's beautiful account books and compiled statistics from every sale that they recorded. But many of those sales were to casual customers who placed only a few orders for only a few books and who drew most of their actual stock from other suppliers whose manuscripts have disappeared. The record of their orders to the STN cannot provide an accurate picture of their business or of the diffusion of individual books or of literary demand in general. So, in order to compile statistics that would hold up, I opted for a strategy of sampling the material, and I limited my sample to 18 regular customers located along this itinerary of the traveling salesman. And it's quite wonderful because in the year 1778, he appears in a bookshop, he writes a report about it. You learn a lot from his observations. He's a kind of ethnographer who gives you a view of the book trade at street level. But then these same booksellers that he investigates in 1778 have very rich dossiers in the archives, many of them covering 20 years and with hundreds of letters in them. So I've taken samples from the 18 most important booksellers along the route of this traveling salesman. Yep, going the wrong way. So here you get a more schematic view of that route. So what I'm trying to do, after reading nearly all of the 50,000 letters in the archives, is to assess the representativeness of these dossiers. And after studying the dossiers in detail, as anyone can do from the open access website I've created, and because I've transcribed all of the letters and reproduced the original manuscripts, I believe I can combine quantitative and qualitative analysis to reach conclusions that I believe are valid for the book trade in general. So we will now skip to a list of book titles. These are the books ordered by this one bookseller in Besançon, so there are 17 others. In alphabetical order, you see the date of each purchase, of each order, and the number of copies ordered. And here are statistics that compile all of the orders of all of the 18 booksellers. I think you can read these as a retrospective bestseller list, if you will permit the anachronism. Now, I don't have time to go into the results in detail, but if you study this list, I think you can enjoy a general view of the demand for literature and also the supply, because in the case of these regular customers, the STN furnished them with nearly every book they ordered. Now, of course, one must allow for a few peculiarities of the STN's trade. And one major objection that I'm trying to deal with is perhaps these 50,000 letters are not representative of the book trade in general. It's a problem, and you have to allow, for example, for the fact that the STN sold a great many Protestant books specialized in editions of the Bible and other religious works. And also, in compiling the statistics, it's important to allow for the fact that the books actually published, printed by this publisher in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, are overrepresented in the general pattern of its business when compared with the books in its general stock, these livres d'assortiment. Therefore, I've actually drawn up two bestseller lists, one with and one without the STN's own editions. Actually, though, they don't differ very much. So to simplify things, I will concentrate on this list without the STN editions and conclude by describing what I take to be the general nature of the demand for literature during the 20 years before the French Revolution. So we begin here. It's probably hard for you to read the titles, but I hope you get at least some idea of these books that I think were the ones that sold the most. Four characteristics stand out. One, a heavy demand for scandalous works, which conveyed a disabused and potentially seditious view of contemporary history, of public figures, and in particular of the monarchy. For example, Anecdotes sur Madame la Comtesse du Barry, Mémoires de l'Abbé Terray, and Journal historique de la Révolution opérée par Monsieur de Maupeou. These works are not exactly, well, they never made it into French literary history, but they were bestsellers at the time, and they conveyed, I think, a very disabused view of the political system. Secondly, works of the Enlightenment, especially, if you like, the more popularized version of the Enlightenment, such as The Year 2440, a utopian novel by Louis-Sébastien Mercier, or general encyclopedic tracts, especially the Histoire philosophique by the Abbé Réal. There was, I found, a surprising number of radical anti-Christian tracts, Le Christianisme dévoilé by D'Holbach, De l'Homme by Helvétius, and a good deal of Rousseau and Voltaire, especially the Voltaire of La Pucelle and the Lettres philosophiques. The third general category, educational and utilitarian works. The popular manual on grammar by Pierre Rétaux, the Latin-French dictionary by Laurent-Étienne Rondet, La vie au peuple sur sa santé by Tissot, and an anonymous anthology of edifying stories for children, Lecture pour les enfants. Fourth category, light fiction, often amusing and spicy. Le Paysan perverti by Rétif de la Bretonne, Le Compère Mathieu by Henri-Joseph Dulaurent, and Sterne's Voyage Sentimental. Sterne was a great favorite in France. If you add to these bestsellers a strong dose of history, especially the works of William Robertson and Claude-François Xavier Millau, also adventurous travel literature, above all Cook, Bougainville, and La Pérouse, and I think you will have a good view of the literary diet of the French. That is, the works that were most in demand on the literary market and the works they actually consumed, whatever consumption may mean in the realm of literature. Thank you.